Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello. Today is the 19th day of the Hebrew month of Sivan, 30th of May, 2021. This is the week of the weekly Torah portion of Shlach, and I'm Leah Roni. Hi, welcome to News from the Torah. Our weekly portion, Shlach, tells the story of the Jewish people sending in spies to spy out the land of Israel before entering the land of Israel 3,000 years ago. And as you obviously know, the spies came back with a bad report telling the Jewish people that the inhabitants of the land of Israel were too strong and they would have a hard time conquering the land. As a result, the Jewish people cried and told God they don't want to go to the land of Israel. And God punished them by giving them 40 years of wandering in the desert until the entire generation of Egyptian slaves would die out and a new generation would be born that will be strong enough and bold enough and courageous enough to enter the land of Israel. So in the past few weeks, we've seen a crescendo of social media and public messages about how the Palestinians are the indigenous people of the land of Palestine, and the Jews are the conquerors who are taking over Palestinian land. And I think there's no better time to actually debunk this myth than on this show this week, when our entire Torah portion this week is devoted to the love and connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Because as we see from this week's Torah portion, if the Jewish people do not belong to the land of Israel, there is no point to the Jewish people. A generation that could not enter the land of Israel had no purpose in living, and then God had to suspend it in the desert until they would die off and until a new generation would come that would be suitable to enter the land of Israel, because without a connection to the land of Israel, there is no point, there is no purpose for the Jewish people. So on this show, we will discuss the Jewish roots and the Jewish connection to the land of Israel and debunk the Palestinian myth and the indigenous people myth of the Palestinians. Stay tuned.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Welcome back. So, as we said, I would like to devote this entire episode of our show to discussing the Jewish roots of the land of Israel and to show you how the land of Israel has always been a Jewish land. There has been a continuous settlement in the land of Israel for 3,000 years, ever since the Jewish people entered the land of Israel. And Palestinians were never an indigenous people here in the land of Israel. So, first of all, how did the land of Israel get the name Palestine? When the Romans conquered the land of Israel, they decided to punish the Jews. They renamed the land from the land of Israel to Palestine. Palestine is a throwback to the Philistines, to the Philistines. The Philistines were actually Greek nations that sailed from Greek islands to the land of Israel and conquered the seaboard and from there tried to make their way inward. And the Jewish people were at a war with Philistines throughout the entire Bible. But what does the word Philistine or Palestine actually mean? The word Philistines comes from the Hebrew root leflosh, to intrude. So Palestine literally means the land of intruders, and the Palestinian people in Hebrew means a people of intruders. Ironically, Palestinians chose the worst possible name for their nation, a name that literally means that they are intruders and not the indigenous people of the land of Israel. Somebody on Facebook, a guy by Thapan Dubai Hudu, has written up a great lineup of all the nations that have ruled the Holy Land. I would like to read it to you. Every now and then, it's good to refresh your memory. The Palestinian state? When did the Palestinian state exist? Before the state of Israel, there was a British mandate, not a Palestinian state. The British got a mandate from the League of Nations, the precursor of the United Nations, to establish a Jewish home in the land of Israel, a mandate they abused. Before the British mandate, there was the Muslim Ottoman Turkish Empire, not a Palestinian state. The Turks conquered the land of Israel in 1516, and at the time they found 30 Jewish communities across Israel, the largest being in Safed, Haifa, Ramleh, Shechem, Jerusalem, Hebron, and Gaza. Before the Ottoman Empire, there was the Islamic State of the Mamluks of Egypt, not a Palestinian state. It is during the Mamluks in the 12th century that Muslims became a majority in the land of Israel, 800 years ago. Before the Islamic State of the Mamluks of Egypt, there was the Ibid Kurdish Empire, not a Palestinian state. Before the Ibid Empire, there was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Christian Crusader state, not a Palestinian state. Before the Kingdom of Jerusalem, there was the Imad and the Fatimid Empire, not a Palestinian state. For the Imad and the Fatimid Empire, there was the Byzantine Empire, not a Palestinian state. For the Byzantine Empire, there was the Sassanids, not a Palestinian state. Before the Sassanid Empire, there was once again the Byzantine Empire, not a Palestinian state. And yes, until the Byzantine Empire, at around 4th century, Jews were the majority of the land in the land of Israel. And it's during the Byzantine period the Jews were driven out of Israel. Until then, they remained in the land despite the persecution of the Romans. So for the Byzantine Empire, there was the Roman Empire, not a Palestinian state. And before the Roman Empire, there was the Hashmonean Jewish Empire, not a Palestinian state. The Hashmoneans, the same as the Maccabees, they're the ones who ruled Israel after the war with the Syrians and the Hanukkah story. Before the Hashmonean Empire, there was a Seleucid one, not a Palestinian state. The Seleucids were the Syrians who conquered the land of Israel for a short time. The Greeks, the Syrians, and they're the ones that the Maccabees drove out during the Hanukkah story. Before the Seleucid Empire, there was the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great, not a Palestinian state. And during the Macedonian period, the Talmud tells us stories of how the Jewish people welcomed Alexander to the entrance of Jerusalem, and with their wisdom persuaded him not to destroy Jerusalem, promising him instead to name every boy who was born that year Alexander. For the Macedonian Empire, there was the Persian Empire, not a Palestinian state. And before the Persian Empire, there was the Babylonian Empire, not a Palestinian state. For the Babylonian Empire, there was the Kingdom of Israel and Judah, not a Palestinian state. And before the Kingdom of Israel and Judah, there was the Kingdom of Israel, not a Palestinian state. Before the Kingdom of Israel was a theocracy of the 12 tribes of Israel, not a Palestinian state. And before the theocracy of the 12 tribes of Israel, there was an agglomeration of independent Canaanite city kingdoms, not a Palestinian state. In fact, on this piece of land, there has been everything except for a Palestinian state. If you travel the land of Israel, you will find archaeological remnants of all of these cultures. There will be the Jewish remnants from the city of David and the Jerusalem temple, and the Herodian buildings from 2,000 years ago, like the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. You will find Jewish fortresses like the Herodion and the Masada. You will find 2,000-year synagogues in places like Jericho and Baram and Arbel. You will find Christian remnants of Crusader settlements in Beit Juvrin, in Kohav Yarden, in Yechimam, and then on the Monfor. You will find Turkish structures such as the Wall of Jerusalem. But there's one thing you will not find. You will not find any Palestinian remnants in the land of Israel. There's simply no Palestinian archaeology in the land of Israel because there was never any Palestinian building in the land of Israel because there was never any Palestinian control in the land of Israel. In 1850, the Ottomans held a census in the land of Israel, and they found 300,000 inhabitants throughout the entire land between Jordan and the Mediterranean. 300,000 people. Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Today, in contrast, 170 years later, there are 15 million people living in the land of Israel, and if you travel around, there's still vast stretches of empty land that this land could take in more and more of its returning children. So anybody who tells you that Palestinians are the indigenous people of the land of Israel and the Jews somehow came in and kicked the Palestinians out or misplaced them or took over their land or took over their property is just lying. Because 300,000 people is roughly the population of 10 smallish towns in Israel today. 10 smallish towns that are built from independent villas, single-family homes. That's it. And the 15 million people living in the land of Israel today wouldn't take anything from anybody. Actually, the contrary is true. When the Jewish people started coming to the land of Israel in big numbers, that is in 1880, the Muslims and the Arabs from nearby countries started coming to the land of Israel too, because Jews created the prosperity and the economy that was not available anywhere else in the Middle East. And with the economy and with the jobs, Arabs from Egypt, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Saudi Arabia, even from places in Europe like Bosnia, started coming to the land of Israel for the opportunity and for jobs and for prosperity. And this is how the Arab population of the land of Israel grew. Now, I challenge you to do the following. Go on Google and look up what's called an n-gram. N-gram. An n-gram will show you the use of any word throughout our recorded history. We have recorded history of all world books since about 1600, and you can trace the use of any word in the past 400 years. So open Google n-gram and type in Palestinian people, and you will see that this term was not in use until 1950. Type in the word Palestinians, and you will see that it was not in use until 1950. Type in the land of Israel, and you will see that this term has been in use since we have records. Now, what you can do in n-gram is to go back and see how different words were used during different periods. So I urge you to look how Palestine, the word Palestine, has been used over the past 500 years. And you will find that Palestine is used in Jewish context every single time it is mentioned before the development for the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Palestine has always and exclusively been used to denote Jewish context and Jewish presence in the land of Israel until the establishment of the land of Israel. And when Israel established itself in 1948 and started calling this land the land of Israel, Arabs hijacked this term and started using it for themselves, calling themselves the Palestinian people, when there was never such a people. And to show you more of this, I will read a passage from 1867 from Mark Twain's Travels to the Land of Israel to hear what he saw with his own eyes here only 150 years ago. Stay tuned.
Hi everyone, this is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back. So, as we mentioned in the previous segment, I would like to read you an excerpt from Mark Twain's The Innocents Abroad. Mark Twain visited the Holy Land in 1867, and he wrote a travelogue. He described his experiences in the land of Israel, and all of his experiences can be summed in one way. It's a desolate, sad place with very few people. It's impoverished and nothing grows here. And what I will read to you now is part of chapter 56. It is how he sums up his visit to the land of Israel before he leaves. So ends the pilgrimage. We ought to be glad that we did not make it for the purpose of feasting our eyes upon fascinating aspects of nature, for we should have been disappointed. At least at this season of the year, a writer in Life in the Holy Land observes, monotonous and uninviting as much of the Holy Land will appear to persons unaccustomed to the almost constant verdure of flowers, ample streams, and varied surface of our own country, we must remember that its aspect to the Israelites after the weary march of 40 years through the desert must have been very different, which all of us will freely grant, but it truly is monotonous and uninviting, and there is no sufficient reason for describing it as being otherwise. Of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. The hills are barren, they're dull of color, they're unpicturesque in shape, the valleys are unsightly deserts, fringed with a feeble vegetation that has an expression about it of being sorrowful and despondent. The Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee sleep in the midst of a vast stretch of hills and plain, wherein the eye rests upon no pleasant tint, no striking object, no soft picture dreaming in a purple haze, or mottled with the shadows of the clouds. Every outline is harsh, every feature is distinct, there is no perspective, distance works no enchantment here. It is hopelessly dreary, heart-broken land. Small shreds and patches of it must be very beautiful in the full flush of spring. However, all the more beautiful by contrast was the far-reaching desolation that surrounds them on every side. I would like much to see the fringes of the Jordan in springtime, and Shechem, Espadron, Yahalon, and the borders of Galilee. But even then, these spots would seem more toy gardens, set at wide intervals in the waste of limitless desolation. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. Over it broods the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. Where Sodom and Gomorrah reared their domes and towers, the solemn sea now floods the plain. in whose bitter waters no living thing exists, over whose waveless surface the blistering air hangs motionless and dead, about whose borders nothing grows but weeds and scattering tufts of cane, and that treacherous fruit that promises refreshment to parching lips, but turns to ashes at the touch. Netherest is forlorn about the ford of Jordan, where the hosts of Israel entered the promised land. With songs of rejoicing, one finds only a squalid camp of fantastic Bedouin of the desert. Jericho, the accursed, lies a moldering ruin today, even as Joshua's miracle left it more than 3,000 years ago. Bethlehem and Bethany, in their poverty and their humiliation, have nothing about them now to remind one that they once knew the high honor. The hollow spot where the shepherds watch their flocks by night, where the angels sing peace on earth, good will not men, is unattainable by any living creature, and blessed and unblessed by any feature that is pleasant to the eye. Renowned Jerusalem itself, the stateliest name in history, has lost all of its ancient grandeur. It has become a pauper village. The riches of Solomon are no longer there to compel the admiration of visiting Oriental queens. The wonderful temple, which was the pride and the glory of Israel, is gone, and the Ottoman crescent is lifted above the spot where, on the most memorable day in the annals of the world, they reared the Holy Cross. The noted Sea of Galilee, where Roman fleets once rode at anchor and the disciples of Jesus sailed in their ships, was long ago deserted by the devotees of war and commerce, and its borders are a silent wilderness. Capernaum is a shapeless ruin. Magdala is the home of beggared Arabs. Bethesda and Chorazin have vanished from the earth, and this desert place around about them, where thousands of men once listened to Jesus' voice and ate the miraculous bread, sleep in the hush of a solitude that is inhabited only by birds of prey and skulking foxes. Palestine is desolate and unlovely. And why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the deity beautify a land? Palestine is no more of this workday world. It is sacred to poetry and tradition. It is a dreamland. If you read Mark Twain's description from beginning to end, you will see him mentioning that he can walk for 20 miles from Tiberias to Tabor and not meet a single person. Every description in this book is full of sorrow and poverty. And we're talking 1867. The land is desolate. And it is supposed to be desolate because it is under a curse. The Bible says that when the Jewish people are in exile, the land will be cursed and it will not produce fruit. And the Ramban, a 12th century Spanish commentator, writes that this is actually a blessing in disguise because the land of Israel only gives fruit to the Jewish people. The Talmud in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, page 98, says the following, and Rabbi Abba says, "You have no more explicit manifestation of the end of days, meaning of redemption, than this following phenomenon, as it is stated, quote, 'But you mountains of Israel, you shall give your branches and yield your fruit to my people of Israel, for they will soon be coming. When produce will grow in abundance in the land of Israel, it is an indication that the Messiah will be coming soon.'" So the sage Rabbi Abba quotes a verse from Yechezkel saying that when the Jewish people will come to the land of Israel, right before that, the land of Israel will start giving abundant fruit. And when the people of Israel are not here, then the land of Israel is desolate. This is the phenomenon that has been in place for 3,000 years since the Jewish people have entered the land of Israel. And if you've never been to Israel, you should come and see how beautiful it is, how gorgeous it is, how flowering it is. And once, about 20 years ago, somebody shared that when they first came to Israel, right after the 6-Day War, they drove down road number 1, which leads from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And on one hand side was Israel, the land that has been part of Israel since 1947. And on the other side of the road were the areas that had just been liberated from Jordan during the 6-Day War. And he says, driving down the road, you could clearly see the side that has been Israel was all forested. There were trees, there were houses, there were communities, there was flowering. You could see a beautiful land. And the side that had just been liberated from Jordan was still desolate, as if you were in the middle of the desert. And this is how the land of Israel has always been and always will be. So no matter how many times the Arabs will say that Palestinians are the indigenous people of the land of Israel, it's just not true. It doesn't hold water. This land has never been inhabited by a people called Palestinians. When Mark Twain visited this land in 1867, there were, like we said, about 300,000 people living in the land of Israel, some of them Muslims, some of them Christians, some of them Jews. Yes, the Muslims were a majority, but this is because every attempt by the Jewish people to resettle the land of Israel, starting in 1500s by Dona Gracia, have failed due to the politics and the policy of the Ottoman government. There have been continuous waves of aliyah, of Jews coming to settle the land of Israel during the 1600s and the 1700s and the early 1800s. And then in 1880s was the first waves of the modern era aliyah. New communities were settled, and more Jews came to settle in Israel and develop it agriculturally and economically. And as waves upon waves of Jewish immigration came and developed the land, additional waves of Arab immigration came from Egypt, escaping the droughts there, from Bosnia, escaping a subscription into the Austrian-Hungarian army, from Syria and from Arabia. As Jews came and developed the land and made it more and more beautiful, more Arabs came to enjoy that prosperity. And this is how we have today a Palestinian nation that was never indigenous in the land of Israel. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
And me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello, I am Walter Bingham. If you want to hear the news behind the news and the true perspective on world affairs, then the Walter Bingham File is the program for you. We bring you interviews with the movers and shakers, political commentaries, and on-the-spot reports of events as they happen. All here every Tuesday, 4 p.m. Israel time, 9 a.m. Eastern time. And it's all archived on our website. Make it a date.
Welcome back. The land of Israel has been on the lips of the Jewish people for 2,000 years. Every time a Jew prays in every one of the 3 daily prayers, Jerusalem and the land of Israel are mentioned numerous times. Every day, 3 times a day, we pray for Jerusalem to be rebuilt. Every day, 3 times a day, we pray for the Jewish people, for the exiles to be gathered in Israel. Every time a Jewish person eats a slice of bread, they say the grace after meals. which includes a prayer for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And every time a Jewish person eats a cookie, a slice of cake, some grapes, we mention the land of Israel and pray to be returned there. Jerusalem and the land of Israel are featured prominently in tens of thousands of Jewish books that have been penned over the past 2,000 years. And I would like to bring one example. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was a noted Jewish philosopher and poet of the 12th century. His monumental book, the Kuzari, is an explanation of all of Jewish philosophy in a setting of a conversation between the king of Khuzar and a rabbi. And he finishes this monumental explanation of Jewish philosophy with a statement from the rabbi that I would like to now leave you and go to the land of Israel. And the king asks why. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, through this monologue of the rabbi, explains the significance of the land of Israel to the Jewish people and how the Jewish people will come back to the land of Israel when the yearning is strong enough. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi also expressed this yearning in his poetry. His most famous poem, Zion, Do You Wonder, is featured prominently in our prayer books. It is a poem that we read every year on Tisha B'Av, the day of the destruction of the temple. And I would like to read this poem to you this afternoon so that nobody can ever tell you that the Jewish people are foreigners in the land of Israel. This poem is almost 1,000 years old, and this is the sentiment that the Jewish people have been having for the land of Israel since time immemorial. So here it is. Zion, do you wonder? Zion, do you wonder how and where your captives are now? And if they think of you, the far-flocked remnants? From north and south, east, west, and all directions, near and far, they send their greetings, as I send mine, captured by my longings, to weep like Hermon's dew upon your mountains, mourning your lowliness. I am the wail of jackals, dreaming your son's return, the song of lute strings. My heart stirs for Peniel and for Bet-El and all those places with their pure traces of God's presence, where your gates, facing the portals of the highest heavens, stand opened by your Maker. You he illuminates, not with the sun, or moon, or stars, but with the rays of his own glory. Gladly I would choose to pour my soul out where your chosen ones stood in the downpour of God's affluence. You are the throne of the Lord, his royal house. How then are slaves enthroned in your Lord's houses? If only I could wander past the waypoints where God appeared to anointed and your seers, and fly to you with a bird's wings, shake woeful head, remembering the throes of your dismemberment, my face pressed to your earth, cherishing its soul and stones. Yes, even so the graves of patriarchs. Wondrous in Hebron at your choicest tombs, I would cross Gilad and Carmel's woods, and stop to marvel at your lofty peaks across the Jordan, on which illustrious lie buried the two greatest of your teachers. Your very air alive with souls, your earth breathes incense, and your rivers run with balm. I would rejoice to walk with my bare feet in tatters upon the ruins of your sanctuaries, in which before it was removed from us, the holy ark stood guarded by its cherubs, posted at the innermost of chambers. And then, all worldly pomp cast off, I'd curse the fate that did defile your peerless pilgrims. How could I eat or drink, seeing the dogs make off with the remnants of your proud lions? How find the daylight sweet when my 2 eyes were forced to witness crows feast on your eagles. Enough. Desist from me, O cup of sorrows, drained to the dregs of all its bitterness. Zion, God's love, combined with beauty's grace, has bound to you the souls of all your friends, so that they joy when you are at peace and weep when you are all wounds and wilderness. Imprisoned, they yearn for you, each from his place, turning to bow in prayer to your gates. Your many flocks disperse to distant hills, yet ever mindful of their vows to reascend to you and reach your heights, as the palm tree rising above all else is scaled by the bold climber. Who compares to you? Not ancient Babylon, nor Greece. What are all their empty oracles besides your prophets and the breastplates of your priests? The hidden kingdom collapse and pass, but you remain forever, crowned for the ages. God makes his home in you. Blessed are those who dwell with him, residing in your courts. Blessed is he who comes and waits and sees the rising sun illuminate your dawns, in which your steadfast share the happiness of your lost youth, restored as it once was. This is a poem that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wrote about his yearning and love for the land of Israel, about the promise that every Jew makes to try and come and reach the land of Israel, the way that the Jewish people have been longing for the land of Israel for the past 2,000 years. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi not only longed to come back to Israel, he actually made the pilgrimage. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi came to the land of Israel, and the story goes that as he was about to descend from the city of Jerusalem towards the Wailing Wall, towards the Kotel, Crusader came on a horse and trampled him with the horse's feet, and he died before he could reach the Kotel. So today the stairs that lead down from the old city towards the Kotel are called the staircase of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, of course, was not the only one. Rashi, the preeminent commentator on the Bible and the Talmud, opens his commentary to the Bible by asking, why does God start the story of the world with the story of creation? Why doesn't God start the Bible with the first commandment? And he answers with a passage from the Talmud that Rabbi Yitzchak in the Talmud said that God started the Bible with the story of creation to tell us that just like God created the world, he created the land of Israel, and he can give it to whomever he wants. So if the nations of the world will ever come to the Jewish people and say that they stole the land of Israel, we have proof. And that proof is God created the world, he created the land of Israel, and he gave it to the Jewish people. And how forescient is this? How, just think about it. The Rashi is writing this commentary on the Torah. And what is his very first explanation? What is his very first commentary? What does he center on? The land of Israel. Because the land of Israel has always been foremost on the mind of the Jewish people. And ironically, almost 1,000 years ago, sitting in France, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki Rashi could foresee that there will come a time when the nations of the world will tell the Jewish people, you stole the land of Israel. And we will have our proof, and our proof starts from the Bible. But just like we discussed today on the show, we have proof from the Bible, we have proof from history, we have proof from archaeology, we have proof from world literature. Every single field of science that deals with human experience, the ones we just listed, point to the fact that the land of Israel has always belonged to the Jewish people, It never belonged to the Palestinian people because there was never a Palestinian people until mid-20th century. There was never a Palestinian state in the land of Israel. And the Jewish people have every right to the land of Israel, and we will continue asserting this right by building this beautiful land. As Arabs choose to torch it, to burn it, to throw rockets on it, we Jews will continue to protect it, build it, and develop it. And in the end, just like we go back to the story of Solomon and the two mothers fighting over one child, it is the mother who wants the child to live at all costs. That's the real mother, not the ones who would want to divide it in order to have it one way or the other. So, thank you for joining me today. It was a pleasure having you on the show, and I will see you again next week. Bye-bye now.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom!
Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.